They called it a cavalry charge. But there were no horses, no sabers, just men young, sweating, anxious, crammed into flying machines, built for speed, not safety. Beneath them, the Central Highlands of Vietnam stretched out like an endless green sea, concealing more than foliage. What they could not see from above, what no training could prepare them for, was that the jungle below was watching them back, waiting. How does a war that claims millions of lives begin its descent into madness? Not with a bang, but with a landing at a place called Landing Zone X-Ray. It was here, in November of 1965, that the United States of America met the People's Army of Vietnam in a full-scale pitched battle for the first time, and it was here that both sides learned just how much they didn't know about the war they had walked into. From a tactical perspective, the Battle of Ia Drang was supposed to be a test. For Washington, it was a chance to see what their shiny new doctrine of air mobility could really achieve. For Hanoi, it was a moment to measure the resolve and method of their new enemy with helicopters, with napalm, with satellites, and with a naive belief that technology alone could win a guerrilla war. The battle would be brief, lasting only a few days. But what it revealed about strategy, about resolve, about the cost of underestimating one's enemy would echo through every American deployment in Vietnam for the next decade. In 1965, the war in Vietnam was still officially South Vietnam's to win. The United States had not yet fully committed ground forces to the conflict, though it was clear that the tide was turning. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, along with irregular CIA-backed militia groups known as the Civilian Irregular Defense Group, CIDG, had been struggling to maintain control over the Central Highlands. This was no minor battlefield, it was a keystone. The Central Highlands served as a staging ground, a hiding place, a corridor. Whoever controlled this dense, elevated jungle could maneuver with impunity through the spine of Vietnam. For the North Vietnamese, it was the gateway to launching broader offensives in the South. For the Americans and South Vietnamese, it was a bulwark they could not afford to lose. By early 1965, it was clear that the South's position was crumbling. Communist forces, including the Viet Cong and the regular North Vietnamese army known officially as the People's Army of Vietnam, PAV, were escalating. The PAVN's B-3 front was tasked with a critical operation, launching a full-scale attack on American and South Vietnamese positions in the Highlands. Major General Chu Huy Man, a veteran commander from the 1st Division of the PAVN, took personal charge of this operation. His plan was bold and layered. First, one regiment would strike the American outpost at Plei Me to tie down defenders. A second would lay in wait, prepared to ambush any arriving reinforcements. And once both of those phases had thinned out American forces, a third regiment would descend to overrun Pleiku City. It was a solid planoon built on the belief that the Americans would act slowly, predictably, and within narrow lanes of engagement, but that belief was about to be shattered. The Americans had other ideas. In a move that would define U.S. strategy for years to come, the 1st Cavalry Division Air Mobile was deployed to the Central Highlands. Unlike traditional infantry divisions, these men would not march into battle. They would fly using UH-1 Huey helicopters. The division was designed to be fast, mobile, and precise. They could deploy a battalion of troops anywhere in Vietnam's unforgiving terrain within minutes, instead of hours or days. It was an entirely new way to wage war, and Pentagon planners hoped it would turn the tide of battle through sheer speed and force projection. But there were flaws, many of them fatal. Helicopter mobility came with vulnerability. Landing zones had to be scouted, defended, and cleared. And once men were dropped, they were at the mercy of reinforcements that could be delayed by weather, enemy fire, or logistics failures. Chu Hui Man knew this. His troops may have lacked air support, but they had tunnels, concealment, and the home field advantage, with 2 regiments ready and the 3rd still in preparation. Man made the risky decision to launch his attack early months ahead of schedule. He could not afford to let the 1st Cavalry fortify Plei Me and dictate the tempo. On the night of the 19th of October, 1965, Plei Me came under fire. The 33rd Regiment of the Pavan struck hard, overrunning outposts and pushing toward the main camp perimeter. By 1 a.m., the defenders were under siege. The South Vietnamese commander had allegedly disappeared into a bunker. Into this chaos stepped a calm, deliberate American Captain Harold Moore. Moore quickly assumed command and called in air support. Beginning at 4 a.m., American aircraft rained destruction on the attackers. For 4 days, the skies were alive with the thunder of jets and the deep tremble of artillery. American forces were holding, but just barely. The North Vietnamese had planned their ambush as well. On the 23rd of October, as ARVN reinforcements advanced to relieve Plei Me, they were struck by the 32nd Regiment in a vicious night engagement. The battle was costly, but the South Vietnamese broke through and lifted the siege on the 25th of October. It was a tactical win, but only that. The Pavan regiments retreated north to regroup. The Americans, sensing opportunity, chose to pursue. Operation Silver Bayonet was launched, a sweeping air mobile assault across the region to find, engage, and eliminate retreating enemy forces. It would take them straight into the Ia Drang Valley. On the 14th of November, 1965, the operation began in earnest. The 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, under the command of Colonel Hal Moore, prepared to insert into a large clearing at the foot of the Chu Pong Masifa rugged mountain near the Cambodian border. Intelligence suggested this area housed significant Pavan concentrations. The Americans named the site Landing Zone X-Ray. There were already complications due to a shortage of helicopters and mechanical issues. Only 80 soldiers could be deployed every half hour. It would take nearly 3 hours to insert the full complement of 431 men. The first waves would be exposed, alone, and outnumbered. Despite this, Moore greenlit the mission. At 10:48 a.m., the first Hueys descended into the clearing, kicking up clouds of red dust and jungle debris. The men leapt out, rifles at the ready, forming a perimeter as best they could. The silence was unsettling. Somewhere in that forest, the enemy was watching. In truth, the Americans had caught the PAVN off guard. General Chu Hui Man was away overseeing supply lines. His deputy, Colonel Nguyen Hu An. I had to rush to the front and take command. The Pavan response was disorganized at first, and Bravo Company took advantage, advancing up the slopes of the massif. They reached within 100 meters of enemy positions before fire erupted, and the everything changed. At around 1 p.m., Colonel An's forces launched a coordinated counterattack. Mortar shells crashed into the clearing. Machine guns poured fire onto the perimeter. Bravo Company's 2nd platoon was cut off and surrounded in the jungle. Colonel Moore responded quickly, ordering Alpha Company to push forward for a rescue, but the enemy fire was too heavy. Helicopters attempting to land with reinforcements were warned to stay away. The LZ had become a death trap. The surrounded platoon, now under the command of Sergeant Clyde Savage, dug in. They could not even dig proper foxholes. The ground was too hard and the fire too intense. Savage recalled, "There was no way we could dig. The handle was blown off my entrenching tool. The fire was so heavy that if you tried to raise up, you were dead." Night fell. Bodies lay silent in the underbrush. Colonel Moore, fearing a second wave, called for reinforcements. They came in the form of Captain Myron Dideric's company, who helped shore up a tenuous perimeter, but this was only day one. The jungle was not yet done with them. As dawn broke over the bloody jungle, both sides braced for more. Colonel Moore's exhausted men had survived the night, but they were barely holding the line. Now came the second act. The enemy was regrouping. Colonel N, having taken stock of his disorganized forces, knew he had missed the chance for a decisive strike. His soldiers were tired, hungry, and disoriented after the chaotic day of fighting. Still, orders had to be followed. He commanded the PAVN's 66th Regiment to prepare for a renewed assault under cover of darkness, but discipline was faltering. The regiment's political commissar, Lanok Cho, reported that the men were too weak, too demoralized to mount a night attack, so they waited silently, miserably just, beyond the American lines, while Colonel Moore's force dug in deeper. At sunrise, the 15th of November, American reinforcements arrived alongside fresh supplies. Among them came something far more decisive: air superiority. U.S. Air Force jets roared overhead in strafing runs, forcing PAVN soldiers to stay low and scattered. But the true turning point came from the sky's heavyweights, from thousands of feet above, unseen and unstoppable. The B-52 Stratofortress bombers from Guam rained death on the enemy's positions. This was Operation Arc Light. No warning, no sirens, just the sudden, deafening rumble of the earth tearing apart as hundreds of tons of explosives slammed into the jungle canopy. Trees evaporated, trenches collapsed. The jungle became a churning cauldron of dirt, fire, and body parts. The Americans couldn't even see the strikes they were called in as a protective curtain around LZ X-ray, falling dangerously close to friendly lines. And yet, even this awesome display of power came at a cost. Some bombs fell short. Napalm canisters ignited within the American perimeter. Moore's command post was hit by friendly fire-2 napalm bombs. Each, a barrel of liquefied fire, engulfed his position. Several soldiers died instantly, and more were maimed. For all its destructive power, U.S. air support was still a blunt weapon. Precision was a luxury the jungle denied. By midday, the volume of PAVN attacks lessened. Colonel N, realizing his 66th Regiment was nearing annihilation, finally gave the order to withdraw. The battered remnants of the North Vietnamese pulled back into the jungle, leaving their dead behind. Colonel Moore, still wary of ambushes, refrained from pursuit. His focus was now on the rescue. The isolated 2nd Platoon of Bravo Company, those trapped since the first day, were finally recovered and evacuated from LZ X-ray. Most were wounded. Some were dead. All were changed. The battle had been hell, but it wasn't over. The next day, the 16th of November, the U.S. Command decided to pull the 1st Battalion back from LZ X-ray to safer territory. The worst, they believed, had passed. 2 fresh battalions, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, and the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry, were ordered to continue operations northward. Their destination? To new landing zones, including one named LZ Albany. What they didn't know was that the Pavin's 8th Battalion from the 66th Regiment had been shadowing them through the jungle for hours. And this time, the North Vietnamese were prepared at approximately 1 p.m. On the 17th of November, the 2 to 7 cavalry reached the clearing at LZ Albany. Tired from the march, exposed by the terrain, and lulled by the previous day's relative calm, the Americans let their guard down. That's when the ambush began. The first sounds were mortar shells. Then came machine gun bursts, sweeping through the formation. Before most soldiers could even drop to the ground, the first rows had been cut down. The Americans scrambled for cover, diving behind logs, fallen trees, and anything they could find. 3 large termite mounds became the focal points of their defense. Then the nightmare truly began. Another Pavin battalion emerged from the tree line, flanking the American position from both sides now. Fire poured in. This was no long-range engagement. The North Vietnamese had studied their enemy and learned that U.S. forces relied heavily on air and artillery to turn the tide. So they moved in close. Too close. So close. In fact, that American air support couldn't be used at all. The fight devolved into a man-to-man, face-to-face brawl, desperate, dirty, and without mercy. One American recalled hearing Pavin soldiers laughing as they fired into wounded men who cried out. As night fell, the battlefield turned into a shadowy realm of death and fear. North Vietnamese troops slipped between foxholes, quietly dispatching the wounded with bayonets or gunshots to the head. One officer, crawling through the brush, later described the horror. You couldn't move or breathe too loud. The wounded were crying out, and the enemy just kept coming. You weren't sure who was alive or who would be next. It wasn't until late in the night that reinforcements from nearby American units finally reached the remains of the 2 to 7 battalion. By then, the worst was over, but so was the battalion. Nearly half of its strength had been lost. The jungle was quiet again. The Battle of Ia Drang officially ended in late November. It had lasted only a few days, but the toll was staggering. Of the roughly 1,000 U.S. troops engaged at LZ X-Ray and LZ Albany, 237 were killed and 258 wounded. The Pavin suffered even greater losses. Over 1,000 dead and at least 500 wounded out of a force of around 2,500. Yet for both sides, this was not a defeat. It was a revelation. For the Americans, Ia Drang proved that air mobility could bring the fight to the enemy, but it also showed how easily that doctrine could crumble in the face of an enemy willing to fight up close and die in the process. Helicopters brought speed, but not safety. Bombers brought fire, but not precision. For the North Vietnamese, Ia Drang taught them a different lesson. The Americans could be beaten, their reliance on technology could be exploited, their need for airspace and their vulnerability in close quarters combat could be used against them. From this point on, Pavin commanders refined a tactic that would haunt U.S. forces throughout the war, hugging the enemy, fighting so close that air support was too risky to use. General Nguyen Hu An would later say, "The Americans have great mobility, but we have great endurance." The Battle of Ia Drang became required reading at West Point. It was studied at Hanoi. It was dramatized in films and immortalized in books. Yet for those who were there, no strategy paper or cinematic slow motion could ever capture what it felt like to fight and survive or fall in that place. Colonel Helmore, who later co-authored We Were Soldiers Once and Young, often spoke of the men who died under his command not as heroes in a grand narrative, But as brothers, taken too soon in a war with no clear beginning or end, Ia Drang did not win the war. It didn't end it either, but it transformed it. It showed the Americans that this would not be a war of short engagements and overwhelming firepower. It revealed to the Vietnamese that courage, concealment, and commitment could blunt the edge of modern warfare. It was a preview of the years to come bloody, were frustrating, endless, and so when the jungle closed in again, when the helicopters lifted off for the last time, and the battlefield fell silent, no one could call it a victory, only the beginning.